So today's lecture we're going to have an introduction to what's called WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation. So kind of going back in history, as the new .NET frameworks came out over time, so you had .NET Framework 1.0 and then 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, etc., etc., they came out with .NET 3.0, which was a big upgrade to the .NET framework, and in this case it came along with Windows Presentation Foundation, or also known as WPF. So what was happening in the time was that all Microsoft had was the Windows Forms as you've been using in class, and you'll notice that it's a little archaic, it's a little bit hard to use, making things look professional as far as your applications go. So Microsoft knew that they needed a new framework to sort of give a better visual environment for users. Sort of like the internet was taking off and HTML and style sheets, that sort of same flavor they wanted to introduce into .NET. So they came up with WPF. So with WPF, they created what's called an XML based language. They call it XAML, or XAML, for Extensible Application Markup Language. Now, XAML is just a syntax. That's all it is. And we can see right here in this sample application in figure 32.1 from our book that we've just got a brand new WPF application that we can take a look at what it actually is going on behind the scenes here. So let's just kind of start at the top now. In the past, we've used Windows Forms, so we've had a form, but in WPF it's called a window. And there's other controls like this, but we're just going to stick with the window for right now. This is sort of the default one that you would get. Over here, you'll also notice some differences in our Solution Explorer, where we've got our main window.xaml file. And then we also have our main window.xaml.cs file. There actually are two completely separate files here. And Microsoft did that on purpose. So the reason they did that is because they wanted to separate out the roles of how people could create these applications. So for example, now since it's actually two completely different files, you have one file that is just your XAML and one file that is just your code. And this code will look exactly like Windows Forms code. The reason for that is now what you could do as a programmer or as a team, you could have your developers, work on this part of your code that understands all the logic going to databases, updating data, etc., and you could have a graphic designer update this code here, the person who understands how colors and shapes and visuals and animations all flow together, so that person with that nice artistic background. So that's why this kind of format is a little bit superior than the other ones we did with Windows Forms. So let's go through some of this just a little bit. You'll notice that we start at the top. We've got this window that we're dealing with. Here are some XAML comments, if you'd like to put those in your code, which it can be helpful when they get a little bit confusing as you code. So this is kind of a new syntax here. This is what's called XML namespaces. So I don't want to go into these too much, but just understand that these are namespaces just like we've used before, and it essentially just defines these various tags that we can use throughout our application. Again, I'm not going to go into this because I don't want to make it too confusing, but that's really all you're doing is you're defining your XML document with these particular tags in it. So just keep that in mind for right now. But we've got our window control. In it we can start setting its properties. You'll notice here's title, here's height, and here's width. I could also click on my window here, and I can come over here to my properties window, and let's sort it by name, makes it slightly easier to read. And you'll look, it looks just like Windows Forms, so I can scroll down, here's the title, right, and I can just change this to anything I want, A, B, C, and you can see it changes it there. Go ahead and set that back. So it should be really familiar. It's just a different syntax that you have to learn, and it's a lot more powerful, which there can be a little bit of a learning curve with WPF versus Windows Forms, and that's why I generally start with Windows Forms. But again, remember that WPF is the only way people develop new applications. Windows Forms is just outdated, it's deprecated, so only use WPF going forward. It doesn't mean it's bad to know Windows Forms because there's a lot of code written in it and you may have to maintain some, but going forward all you'd ever use is WPF. Also on this window class, you'll notice we've got this tag right here. And what it does is it says in this namespace, this class is what this file is linked up to. So here's the namespace, XML introduction. If we come over to our code, you can see there's the namespace. And then in our code, it says point to the class main window. That's how these two files are linked up. So if you come back over here, you notice here's the class main window. So in Windows Forms, everything was in one file, and it was C# code that actually generated the UI for you. Where in WPF, it's separate. There's two separate files, one for the UI and one for the code behind. It's a little bit different paradigm. You just sort of get used to it. Now let's take a look at just a very simple app of how they created their WPF here. So the first thing here, we have what's called a layout container, and that's called a grid. A grid is just a table. Probably done this in some HTML where you had some sort of HTML table that you put rows and columns in and things like that. That's all a grid is, just rows and columns. Now this one's very simple. We just have one row, one column. We'll get into grids in just a little bit. But there's other kinds of container controls like canvases and stack panels and things like that that we'll take a look at in just a minute. So here in our grid, you'll notice that we've set the back color to gold. Now we could have clicked on our grid over here and you can see here's our back color. Now WPF, when you start going into the properties, you're going to notice a lot more control over how you want to set these things. Where in Windows Forms, to do something like this, where it's a gradient, would be extremely hard to do. So here's another type of, you can see how it's actually creating that gradient for me. So it's just another way that it'll give you a little bit more power. So in this syntax, it's saying inside my grid, now I want to set the grid's background property. So that's how these tags set up. And then inside that background, I want this thing called a linear gradient brush. And so because it's gradient, you have to actually start setting when you want the gradient to start, when you want it to stop, the colors in between. So I'm just going to go ahead and we'll just set this back just so it's a little bit easier to look at for right now. Now within our grid, we have a label control. Here's our label. The content of our label is sort of like text, but what it means is we can actually put anything we want inside this content. Because we had it in quotes here, it is smart enough to say, oh, you just want to display a string here. But you can actually assign any kind of object to this content property. We'll revisit this in a little bit. We're also setting the horizontal and the vertical alignment. So you can see why that is centered, this label, inside this grid. Now when we run it, it's going to run just like any Windows Forms application. It's just WPF now. And you can see that here's our application. And we can extend, as we make it larger, you can see the background even takes up the entire thing there. Now this actually behind the scenes, there's what's called a XAML parser. So when I build this, there's actually files, regular C# files that get created instead of this XAML file. Everything is an actual C# because these are actually C# classes. So if I hide this or highlight this, you can see system.windows.controls.grid. This is a class, just like any other class that we've instantiated, like the random class, for example. Here is a label. So the reason I'm pointing this out is because anything you do here in your XAML, you can also do inside your code over here. So for example, if I come back over here, here's my label. Let's go ahead and give my label a name. And so let's call this LBL, test label. And now when I come into my code here, let's say when the user maybe clicks on the label. So if I come over here, we can see that there's all kinds of events, just like Windows Forms, that we can do. And so we just have to pick an event, something like maybe mouse down. So we come here, let's do mouse down, mouse left. How about mouse left button down? I'll double click right there. And so this code will execute when mouse left button is down. Do .content equals hello. And so now when I run this, it pops up. I click this and it changes to hello. I could also, if I wanted to, inside this grid, I could also add controls dynamically in the code behind. So in my grid, I could say add child control of label or text boxes, or etc., etc. So you can build this UI just like you want behind the scenes in code. So this is kind of a very basic XML program or XAML program. Go ahead and close this one down. Let's go ahead and create one of our own now. So here's our Visual Studio. Here's our WPF application. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one. Go ahead and click Next. Doesn't matter the name. You'll notice we're using .NET 6.0 in this particular case. Go ahead and click Create. It's going to have an application very similar to what we just looked at. And here we go. So there's our first application for Windows Presentation Foundation. Again, well, here's our main window for our UI, and behind the scenes we can double click right here and we can see here's all of our code behind. Now you'll notice that nowhere in here do we have a main method. But let's take a look at some of the other files here. So if I go into assembly information, there's really nothing helpful in here. We don't need to worry about this for right now. But there's also this app.xaml file. So if I double click this, you'll notice that it is XAML, but the main thing to understand in here is this startup URI. And you'll notice that it's called mainwindow.xaml. So what this is telling us is that when our application first starts, what I want the application to do is start by displaying this main window file. So now if you ever created a new window over here, so if I right clicked and said add new window, WPF window here, and I wanted that one to start up first, then I'd have to change this right here. Now when you build this behind the scenes, again, there's C# files that are auto-generated for you because it parses all of this, and behind the scenes it actually creates that main method that all of our applications have to hold. Also within this file, this app.xaml file, you notice it's at the application level. So if you need anything that's global, like a global resource, you would put it right here. In following lectures, we'll talk about what these resources actually are. But these could be things like fonts or images or styles, controls. We'll take a look at that later. So here's our very basic program. Now I'm going to go up here and we'll do View, and let's take a look at our toolbox here. And so just like in Windows Forms, we've got all kinds of different controls that we can just drag and drop onto our window up here. And also here I'm just zooming in and out by holding down the control character and then my mouse wheel. And that's the same thing for our XAML here if we want to make that larger or smaller. So we've got our window here, we've got some XML namespaces. You can see here's our title that defaults to main window. We've got a default of height and width and our blank grid. So let's just take a look at some just normal controls for WPF. Again, there's lots of controls. In later lectures, we'll go over a lot more of these individually. For now, I just would recommend you play with them and just get used to the different controls and the different properties associated with each one. For right now, we'll go over just some of the basic ones. That's really all you'll need for any of the programs that we're going to be dealing with at first. So here's a nice button that we just dragged onto here. Make it a little bit larger. Now you can see all that did for me when I dragged my button over to here was it just wrote the XAML for me. Just like in Windows Forms, how it wrote the C# code for you, this just writes the XAML. You're just doing it visually, so when I change my width and height here, it's going to change my width and height here for me. Or if I wanted to, again, I can change any of this in my properties window. A lot of times what I've personally found is it's just faster after eventually you know the names of all these properties, so you can actually just type them right within here. So for instance, if I want to set the width and I was typing this out and I delete this and I press my space bar, you can see that it actually has IntelliSense for me. So over time you sort of get used to that syntax and the IntelliSense rather than having to go over here to the properties, but it's completely up to you. And on top of that, I forget a lot of these properties. So what I'll do is if I need to know how to code something, I'll drag my button over here, look through, and I can kind of remember the property. So for instance, it's content or flow direction or whatever it is. I just read through here and it refreshes my memory, and then I know how the syntax to put here or in the code behind. So here's our button. Now if we come over here, let's just kind of start going through some of the properties just like we've done with Windows Forms, but now we've got our XAML button. So we had a Windows Forms button and now we have a XAML button. Now those are contained within different DLLs that are included. So you'll see here's one right here, Microsoft.Windows.Desktop.WPF, and we've got all these different DLLs associated with that. That Microsoft has already written for us what it means to be a button, for instance. Now we can come through here, and again, we've got our button. We can change the name of the button if we want. Come down here, maybe how about the background property? So if we come up here, we can open up the background. Maybe we want a nice blue. There you go. I can also click on here. Here's our solid color brush. We could do our gradient. So maybe we wanted a nice gradient. So we wanted this to look a little bit more professional. And so now I make this a little bit larger. And you can see now this looks very professional. I can come down here. We can do things like change what the cursor looks like, the flow direction of our text, font size. This is something for our, there we go, make it a little bit more readable. Whether the type of font style you want, the font weight. Here we go, if we want bold, for instance, we can do that. All the typical properties that you've probably already used to. Now we do need to understand a few different ones, like is enabled. So this is just whether or not the control itself is enabled and you could click on it or not. But that is different than something like visibility. Now visibility is a little bit different between Windows Forms and WPF. So you'll notice that I've got these ones called visible, hidden, and collapsed. Where in Windows Forms it was just visible or invisible. Well, visible is exactly the same like you would expect it. But what does it mean to be hidden versus collapsed? So you'll notice there's collapsed and there's hidden. Well, the difference is that collapsed means you can, for all intents and purposes, this button, when you parse it, it's not even going to exist in our XAML. It's almost like you've deleted it from our layout here. But if you did hidden, it's more like just making it invisible. It's still there, it's still taking up space, but it's just invisible to the user. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility based on how you want your UI, because as we'll learn in a minute, WPF allows for this flexibility where we can expand and contract based on the size of the controls within our grids or canvases, etc., etc. So now we've got our button on here. Let's go ahead and just get rid of our button now. Let's take a look at another one. Let's drag a label on here. So here's my label. Go start going through some properties. Now the label, you'll notice, also has my content. There's my label there. I can do things like the forecolor. I can change the back color, the font size. It's going to be very similar. There shouldn't be much of a learning curve between a button, a label, a text box, things like that we saw in Windows Forms versus WPF. Just remember there's things like content versus text, for example. So now a text box, you'll notice there's nothing called content within a text box, but there is a text property. So there is differences between a lot of these controls where if it says content, it means that you can assign anything you want to the content, where text box, you can't do that. You can just assign the text. What I mean by that, it'll be a little bit more clear here in a minute as we start creating some other applications. So within this, looking at these different controls here, we kind of just went over the grid, but we talked about a canvas, we talked about stack panels and things like that. But whenever you first start your application, you kind of want to get your head wrapped around how you want the application to be formatted and how you want it to look, your window. Windows Forms, we were dragging and dropping all these controls and we were setting it. We were essentially, when you dragged a button onto a Windows Form control, you were hard coding, 10 pixels over, 20 pixels down, the exact location of this button. Where in WPF, it gives you a lot more flexibility where you can either hard code exactly where you want it, or you can start using like percentages, and it gives you a lot more flexibility. So maybe you only want this button, you always want it 25% to the left of this window. So you can do a lot more things like that. You can have this sort of relative versus absolute positioning. So you'll notice as I move my button around, it is hard-coded because it's using this margin. It's saying give my button a margin of 168 and 158. So it's not actually giving it a position, it's just giving it a margin. So it, all intents and purposes, moves it to wherever you want it. And that's how it's actually telling it where to go inside this grid. Now normally with a grid, you'd set up rows and columns. Now if you really did want to just sort of hard-code everything, you would use a canvas control. If you use a canvas control, then it really does put it exactly where you're telling it to go. And it'll work a lot like a Windows Forms application. in that you're not going to get this expanding and contracting functionality that you would with a grid. And you're not going to get any of that relative positioning. It's going to be more absolute. So you'll notice as I move my button around, it's going to change this Canvas.Left and Canvas.Top properties. So what is that? That's really strange. Well, these are what are called attached properties. And it's just a different type of syntax. It's how they came up with saying, okay, I've got my button, but how do I tell my button where to be positionally in relation to the canvas that I'm inside of? Because it's really hard, because think about that. How would you put a tag on the canvas to tell this button where to go? You could have 500 buttons, within, you could as many as you wanted. So how up here would you tell it where each one of these buttons should be located? So they came up with this attached property syntax where it says, hey, I'm inside of a canvas and I'm going to set the left property of my button at 104 pixels from the left and 81 pixels from the top. So it's called an attached property. So that's how you tell this button where its position should be inside of this canvas. Again, you kind of get used to it over time. You kind of figure it out, and it becomes more and more readable as you use it a few times like that. So that's the difference between a canvas and a grid. Where a grid, you're going to set up rows and columns, and you're going to tell it which row or which column you want your controls in. Where a canvas is just more like Windows Forms, where you can put it wherever you want. Now, I'll leave my canvas here for just a second, but I just wanted to show you that there's other controls. One of the more popular ones is what's called a stack panel. Now, in a stack panel, when you have this, let's go ahead and set the content to something. And you'll notice, this is also a good point, is that you notice when I have this in bracket here, it actually sets up my label like this, but another way that you can do this, if you don't want it to look like that, this is a little bit cleaner syntax, where it puts everything on one line. Now you'll notice in this stack panel, let's do hello 1, 2, 3, and you can probably see what the stack panel is doing up here, where it just literally stacks these controls one on top of the other. Also on the stack panel, you can then tell it the positioning that you want it to do. So you can tell it to go from left to right or right to left. Or you can go horizontal or vertical. There's all kinds of different ways you can do. So you can see it's a stack panel, but now we're doing horizontal. So the reason that this is nice is that you notice that we're not hard coding any of the positions into our controls here. And that's really important when you're creating your application, because you want this sort of flow layout. So just imagine that you have to create a Windows application for every different resolution for all the different monitors out there. Now, it's perfectly okay to say I expect my window to have a minimum and maximum height and width, which you can also set on your window. There are you see here's a max height, for example, and a min height. And that's what I do when I'm creating my professional applications. The very first thing I do is I say, okay, what is the minimum here? Like, there has to be something. Like 800 by 600 is just not going to be acceptable resolution. And you can just say that up front. Whatever that is, come up with what your minimum resolution is and set your window to that. And then what I would do is I would use a grid for everything within my application, and I would use rows and columns in order to set this flow layout where things can expand and contract so that it can take up the entire screen. So just think about the Windows Forms application you created up to this point. If you made that window take up the entire monitor, everything just sort of stays very small. Where you want things to expand and contract naturally, and that's what WPF will give you. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at that. Let's kind of create ourselves a grid, and let's play with some of that stuff. So inside of our grid now, let's drag a button. I want to kind of go over this content just a little bit more for us. So what I can do now is inside this button, let's say that I want it to look a little bit different. So what I can do is, now remember, the button has what's called a content property. So let's go ahead and get rid of this content property here. What I want to do is I actually want to define that content of my button. In WPF, you can make a button look any way you want. For example, inside this button, I can put any control I want. Now, just like the window, it's called a content control. Now what that means is that whenever you have something called a content control, it can only hold one item. So because a button is what's called a content control, it can only have one element inside of it. For example, I could put something like a canvas inside here. Now what I couldn't do is put multiple labels within this. So if you have a content control, you have to put something inside of it like a container, like a grid or a canvas that can then hold multiple controls. So again, a button can only have one control inside of it, and you need something like a container, like a canvas or grid. So now that I've got this canvas inside there, let's go ahead now and let's put maybe an ellipse inside here. So I'm going to create this ellipse. Maybe what we'll do is we'll have it a width, 30. We'll have a height of 30. We'll do a background. So now we'll come over here and you can start seeing, let's change, not background, it's fill. See, even I forget all the name of these different properties. So we're just going to have our fill set to red. Now remember, this is a button that we're setting this canvas inside of, and here's our ellipse. Now maybe with our button, I'm going to do a height, of 100, width of 100. So inside of our button, we've now said put a canvas and put an ellipse in here. We could also, if we wanted to, we could put a label in here, and then our label, content, will say hello. Now obviously this isn't the best looking button of all time, but I just wanted you to get the idea that my button, I can make this look any way I want, and because of that content property, I can put anything I want inside of my button. Now again, I can't say I want this label, and I can't say I want another label inside here. And you notice it gives me this syntax error because it's a content control and you can only have one element inside the button there. So let's go ahead and delete that out, and let's go back to our grid now. We'd shown you before how with our canvas that everything was hard-coded. But now we're going to work with our grid and show you how to make things a little bit more flexible. So let's go ahead and change our Windows height and width to, let's say, 400. So now we've hard-coded our width and our height of our window here. Let's go ahead and move this so we can see it a little bit better. So there's our window, the height and width of 400. Now, what we're going to do is we want to now start adding some columns and rows to our grid. So let's go ahead now and add some columns. So there's a couple different ways we can do that. We can either hard code them here, just type them in, or in our visual designer, you'll notice if I click up here that it'll actually create rows and columns for me. So I click up here and it's saying, oh, I think this is what you wanted. Now I just wanted to do this so it'll show you the syntax, because even I forget, again, this syntax of we're saying in our grid we want to create some column definitions, and oh, by the way, here are our column definitions. Just ignore this syntax for right now. Now again, we could have typed these manually, so let me delete out this one, get rid of that, and let's just say we want this column to have a width of, let's say, 300, and we want another column and change this, let's say, to 100, something like that. So now we've got two columns, a width of 300 and a width of 100. Now if I zoom out a little bit, let's make this a little bit smaller so you can see it a little better. You can see now it even tells me up here how this column has a width of 300. This column has a width of 100 because I defined those two columns right here. Now if I wanted to, I could also say grid dot row definitions. Oops, it didn't go down there. So here's my row definitions. Again, if I want to do the row definitions, which we will in just a minute. But let's pretend our top grid only has columns and 1 row. So by default we get a single row, so we actually don't need to define it. And in this case we're saying, hey, just have our row take up as much space as possible. But we're also saying we want 2 columns, one's 300 and one is 100 for here. Now within our grid we're going to add another grid. So I'm going to type in a grid and put that there. Now if I don't put anything else, no other tags, it defaults to row 0 and column 0. Now if we want to, we could actually go ahead and actually say, for example, grid.row equals 0, grid.column equals 0. So again, we've only got 1 row, so by default we didn't even need this or this because it defaults to 0. If we wanted it in the second column, we could put a 1 here, and you can see it actually moved over to right here. But let's just go ahead and leave it at 0 and 0. I'm also going to add something on here called show grid lines. Now when you set this show grid lines, you don't want to leave this on for your application. This is sort of like a debug tool where you can kind of see the grid lines of your grid. But again, you would always want to turn this off before releasing your application. Just kind of the way you do things. So now that we've got that set up, let's go ahead now and let's add some columns to our subgrid. So let's set up here, we'll do column definitions. And you can see the IntelliSense and everything is just sort of filling things in for me. And now let's just we'll do our column definition. So let's go ahead and add 3 columns to our subgrid. So now again, just to reiterate, we've got our grid that takes up our entire window. It has 2 columns in it. So it has this column over here, which is 300, and this column over here, which is 100. Now within this column, we've now created another grid that has the show grid lines on, and we're going to go ahead and create 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, inside of our grid. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do grid.row now. So let's go ahead and set up our row definitions, and we'll do our row definition like this, and let's go ahead and add 3 rows to it. Now you'll notice this is sort of like a tic-tac-toe board where we've got 3 rows and 3 columns, and you'll notice that it takes up the space of this first column inside of our top grid. So again, it just kind of takes time. You'll get used to setting up these grids, but it's really not too bad. You just kind of focus on whatever grid you're working on at the time, and you know where that's located at within your structure here. So now we've got 3 columns and we have 3 rows. What I'm going to do now is we're going to hard code in the width, and we'll set this to 100. We'll do this for each of our columns. And you can see now our columns is 100, 100, 100. Now if I wanted to, I could have set this to any size I wanted. Now what I want to point out is kind of the reason I chose these numbers ahead of time is, one, our entire window, first off, has a width of 400. Okay, the entire window. In our application, we now have our main grid that has a width of 300 and 100 for its columns. Now because this is 300, that's why I chose 100 for each of these here, so that it would come out exactly for the math as far as the width goes. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for our rows. So instead of width now, we're going to do height. And let's go ahead and set those to 100 also. And that way we kind of got some squares set up for our grid. Now you'll notice this little extra space down here. It's not actually extra space. It's really, this is 100, 100. It actually ends right here. And I'll show you just in a second why that is. But if you were to come up here on our height, you'll notice that our height is also set to 400. If I would have set this to 300, you'd see it would look more like you were thinking it should. But because it's 400, we still have this whole width taken up. Now what I can do is, now that I've got these 9 sort of cells created, I can start adding things to them. So inside of my grid, so let me expand this up a little bit here. You can see, so here's my grid from here to here. And a lot of times what I start doing when I'll actually collapse some of this XAML down. So if I've already figured this out, I can collapse that down so I can look at the parts that I care about. Same thing here. If I want to, I can collapse these down, make it a little bit more readable. And so now I'm actually going to start adding items within my grid. So the first thing I want to do is let's just add a label into our grid. Now, because I haven't set the row and column properties, that you'll notice that it actually defaults to 0 and 1. So I'm just, rather than typing this out, I'm just going to paste this here. So I'm saying put my label in this top left column here. Now what I can also do is I can actually set the background, and let's set that to like the color red. And so the reason I'm going to do that is just so we can see exactly where that label is. Now you'll also notice that my label, because I haven't hard-coded any width or height, you can see that it automatically is taking up 100% of the width and the height. Now if we wanted to, we could do something like this. Now let's say we want it, let's set this middle box here. So now we want to go to row 1, and you can see now it's this one, and then we want column 1. So I set it to column 1. And now maybe we want this one set to blue, or whatever else it is. Now let's go ahead and set another label. And we can set this one to green. But rather than the middle one, let's kind of set the bottom right column. So we'll set that there. Now remember how I was telling you before, you can see that that row is actually taking up 100 pixels. We've hard-coded that row in there. You can see, so each of these are actually taking up 100 pixels by 100 pixels for the columns, because it was hard-coded. Now, in the real world, you generally don't want to hard-code things. Maybe the width, the normal, the initial width and height, or you could dynamically do it, but for the most part, I very rarely set these to actual pixels. I normally do more of a flow layout that we'll get to here in just a second. So what I want to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and run this application. Now when this application pops up here, what you're going to see is that in a Windows Forms application, if I were to make this as large as possible, or I were to expand the width and height of the entire window, these would stay exactly the same size. But watch what happens now. As I do this, you'll notice that nothing else happens, just like Windows Forms. So why didn't I get that flow layout that I've been talking about of percentages? Well, it's because I hard-coded the width and height here. So what I've done is I've made it act just like Windows Forms because I've hard-coded everything. So if I were to make this as large as my entire screen, you can see I've got all this extra wasted space now. Where in a lot of our applications, that's not what we want. What we'd like it to do is actually take up all of our space. So let's talk about how we could do that. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to come back up here to this top grid. Now you notice we hard-coded the width and the height. So when I ran my application, no matter what I did, this width was always 300 and this was always 100. So when I ran it, it doesn't matter how large I open this up, this always stays 300 by 100 no matter what. But maybe we want it to actually expand. So WPF has a different syntax, and it's not percentages. It's a little bit different where it's called proportional sizing, and it can be a little bit confusing, so we're going to go through multiple examples here, and over time you just sort of get used to it. What I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to type in the syntax here, 3 star, and then I'm going to put another star here. Now what this actually says is that this first column, I want it to take up 3 parts of the space available, and this column I want it to take up 1 part of the space available, and that's called proportional sizing. Now how this works is it first determines that if you had a column, and let's say this column we actually did hard code, say 300 pixels. Then what it does is it looks for anything with the auto keyword. Then it looks for anything with this proportional sizing. And so I'm going to go through this now to try to explain what I've really told it to do. So here I've hard coded it. This is pretty straightforward. Hey, this column, this up here, take 300 pixels for this entire column. Now I've got 2 other columns, one set to auto and one set to 2 star. What auto says is take up the least amount of space possible for the controls that are contained within that column. So it just so happens that we don't actually have any controls over here, so it doesn't need to actually take up any space. That's why this two parts is taking up the entire rest of our space here. But if we had had something in our second column over here, like a label, it would be scrunched up and only take up as much size as that column needed. Now I'm going to kind of go back here, and let's just go back to our 3 parts and 2 parts. So what it's saying now is, you can even see it changes up here. So 3 parts of the total size goes to this, and 2 parts goes to this. So let's go ahead and run our application. And again, it's not like we want to how we want it to look, but you can kind of see that when I do that, you can see that these columns are now starting to actually give us a little bit larger because they're proportional sizing. These ones are still hard-coded, so we've still got a problem with our application. Because these ones down here, if you remember, we actually hard-coded the width and we hard-coded the height of our rows. So let's make this a little bit bigger or a little bit different. So let's actually just change these to both to star. So this is the equivalent of saying 1 star on each. So you'll notice that it says take up 1 part for this row or this column and 1 part for this. Now, if I run my application, now again, because my columns are still hard-coded down here, but it's saying, you'll see how the grid lines go up to exactly half of my application. So it's saying 1 part for this, 1 part for this. Now, you might be thinking, well, that sounds a lot like percentages, maybe something like this. Now, what's nice about proportional sizing is it actually works as if you were to use percentages. And that's what I really like about it, is that you can use it either way. Personally, I think this way is a little bit more readable and understandable in the sense that it's, even though it's 50 parts, it's the same thing as saying 50% and 50%. Or I could say 75% and 25%. So hopefully you can kind of see how that comes up there. So it's very powerful, but it can also be a little bit confusing. Again, that's why I generally will do a syntax like this for all of my columns. But again, you'll have to make sure this adds up to 100. But that's easy enough. So now I've said, okay, this first column take up 75% essentially, and this one take up 25%. Now let's work on our grid here, that we will actually want these boxes to take up the full amount of rows and columns that we've got for our window. So what we can't do is hard code width and height. And in the applications I write, whenever I notice that I've done something like this, I almost always pause and say, should this be hard coded? Now there are times where maybe I want a text box, for instance, that holds a first name to only have a width of 100, something like that. I don't want the text box to expand and contract, which is fine, again. But again, I always ask myself that question of why I hard coded that. So now what we can do is we can come down here and we've got our column definitions. So rather than hard code these, we can now start saying how much space we want them to take up. So for example, let's change all of these now to star instead of 100. So let's do that. Let's change that one to star, that one to star, and that one to star. Now let's run our application and see what happens. And we can see now that as I expand and contract these, you can see now they're saying take up 100% of the space that it can. It's going to take up everything because I haven't hard coded those. So now, again, this is a simple example, but you can see now if I had an application that the user wanted to take up the entire resolution, they could do that. Or if they want to, they can make it as small as possible. Now again, you'd probably want to set it so they couldn't go any smaller than a particular size. But hopefully you can start seeing the flexibility and the power of WPF versus how hard something like this would be. You would have to do this in Windows Forms. You'd have to calculate all of this behind the scenes and start getting into math and percentages, and you'd have to know how big the window is and how big each column is. And it's a tremendous amount of work, where with WPF it's fairly straightforward. And again, if you wanted to do, you could set these up as percentages based on how you wanted it set up. I mean, if you wanted to, you could have this one set up as 10%. You could have this one set up as 10%, and you could have this one set up as 80. You know, oh, sorry, 80%. So you can see that just by doing that, I now have set that up for each one. Let's go ahead and set that back. So that's how these different, whether it's a star, whether it's auto, or it's hard-coded, how they all work with. There's no way you can learn this by just listening to me. You have to sit down, you have to start writing out grids with columns and rows, and just play with it. It's just going to take time. And it can be a little bit confusing, but again, just set up various rows, various columns, and just start calculating them in there, and it'll start to make more and more sense for you. So now let's go ahead and start going through some examples in the book and take a look at what we can actually do with WPF. So this first application, if I go ahead and run it, let's take a look at what it does. You'll notice that first I can select a color. I can also set a size. So let's set it to red and large. And what this is it's a drawing application. So you can see I can actually draw, or I can clear the form, or I can change the color and do small. What's actually happening behind the scenes here is every time I do a mouse down, it sets a variable, and then every time I move my mouse, it draws a circle. And it happens so fast that it's kind of hard to see that it's actually a circle that it paints whenever I click that button and move my mouse just a little bit. So it continually just draws circles everywhere I move my marker. So to think through how I do this in code, so somewhere I'm going to have to set it to red, somewhere I'm going to set the size. It's going to have to figure out a position, and it's going to have to know when my mouse is down versus mouse moving versus mouse up to not draw. So let's go ahead and take a look at how they actually created this application. And first let's take a look at the XAML, because there's a lot of new concepts here. So let's start at the top. We've got our window. So that's our entire window. And you notice that they've hard-coded the height and the width of our window. Next, we've got a grid. Within that grid, let's go ahead and open up this here. You can see that we've got some column definitions. So in our column definitions, we have two columns. One is set to auto, and one is set to star. So what this is telling us is that this first column, we only want it to take up the available space. Essentially, we're saying make it as small as possible. Now the reason for that, if we run our application, is because what we want to have as large a drawing area over here as possible, so that as I start drawing, you can see that I could actually expand this application to take up as much room as I want. Where if this was Windows Form, it was hard-coded and it would be just this particular width and height. So again, the auto says this column here only take up as much width as it needs for these other controls within inside of it. This over here says take up all of the other space. That's what that means. So we've defined these two columns. Now let's take a look over here and let's see what it has. Now what's interesting about this setup is that if I click right here, notice that this is the canvas here, where my stack panel is this here. So what we can learn from this is that it doesn't matter the order that we put things in our XAML. So notice, just because this came first does not mean that it's going to go into this row and column over here. It's not going to go into column 0. So how do we put it over here even though it came first? Well, if we expand this out, right here we can see that it says go into grid.column sub1. So it goes over here into this second column. So again, it just doesn't matter the order. What it matters is what you actually specify of where it should go. Now you didn't put the row because since there's only one row, it defaults to row 0. We've named the canvas so that in our code behind we can say paint canvas dot and access any of the properties. Now here is how XAML sets up your events. So if I had wanted to, I could come over here and go toolbox and I could drag a button over just for the time being. If I were to double click this button, so this is just like our normal C#, right? Our Windows Forms, this is the event that gets called. But if we come back over here to our XAML, you notice on this button, here's how it gets wired up in our XAML, where we just say, hey, the click event called this method. Or if I come over here, you can see that I could have just typed it right here and it would have written this code for me. So that's how events in WPF are wired up. But they said, okay, I want to create a little drawing canvas over here, so I'm going to need to wire up several of the events. So they went through all the different events and said, okay, which ones are helpful for me? Well, we needed something a little bit more helpful than just a click. So for instance, you'll notice we have mouse left button down, left button up, mouse move, right button down, right button up. And so they're actually handling all of these. So for example, mouse left button down is, hey, I've now pressed the mouse down, I'm going to want to start painting. So if I were to go over to the code, you can see that all it does is it sets a variable called should paint to true. Well, we'll go through this code in just a second, but that's all it does. It just says, should I paint? Yes, because there's going to be another one, hence the mouse move event, that's going to look at this should paint. That's going to say, should I be painting or should I not, based on the mouse up or mouse down events. So that's all there is to this canvas control over here. Now you'll notice again that this canvas automatically is taking up all of the room because I haven't set any width and height for my canvas. Now let's go over here to our stack panel. Now, they could have chosen to use a canvas. They could have chosen to use a grid. There's a myriad of other controls they could have used. They chose to use a stack panel. Now you'll notice that what they're essentially doing, let's open this up. Oh, now they've actually created two new controls, a group box and another group box, and a button and another button. And because they're all within a stack panel, you can see that in the UI, see this one is stacked upon this one, which is stacked upon this one, and stacked upon this one. So let's take a look at this first group box. Now this one, you'll notice that there's a margin of 3 set up for it. So just to make it obvious, let's change that to 30. So what it's saying is around my group box, set a margin of 30. Now if you want to, you can individually set the top, left, right, and bottom margins, but if you say just one number here, it applies it to all of the margins around there. So what does a group box give us? Well, it gives us this header. So you'll notice that here's my group box, and you can see it kind of gives us this nice border here. And so it's just, a group box is just a way to organize your code. And so you can see within my UI, I know now that all of these radio buttons are contained within this group box. So visually I can say, oh, these radio buttons are all associated with the color. These radio buttons are all associated with the size. So the user that's using this can very easily say, okay, I know I need to select one of these, and I need to select one of these. Now the other thing to point out is that these are radio buttons. So how does it know that these are a grouping and these are a grouping, right? Because they're individual. So a radio button, you can only have one selected at a time. Well, in WPF, when you come over here, you have to, all of these radio buttons are considered to be in a group if they're all within the same container control. So because they're all within this stack panel, only one of these can be checked at a time with this isChecked property. So we've got this group box. Now within our group box, they decided to create another stack panel. So you could have done a grid, you could have done a canvas, but what's nice about a stack panel is it automatically gives you in that flow layout by default. And it's kind of nice because you can set the horizontal or vertical stack of each of these controls. Now within there we've got these various radio buttons that are just stacked one upon the other, and each one of them is handling the checked method. So every time I check one of these different events are going to get called, and all it's really going to do behind the scenes is says if I check this one, set a variable to red, set a variable to blue, set a variable to green. That's all that's going on behind the scenes. Now if we take a look at this next group box, you can see that they've got another stack panel here and a couple more radio buttons, same idea. And then down here we've just got a couple other buttons, and that's our layout. In the code behind, what we've done here is we've got a couple class level variables for the brush color, should erase, should paint, and then the diameter, which they can also set. They've got an enumeration for small, medium, and large. Down here, they've got a method that just paints the circle. So you pass this particular method, passes in a brush, which is a color basically, and it passes in a position. So based on where the user has clicked, they pass in that information, create a new ellipse, fill it up with some data, and then paint it to our canvas. So you'll notice here's this paint canvas. If I come over here, this canvas is called paint canvas. So all they're saying is okay, my paint canvas, its children add this ellipse to it. So every time this method gets called, a new ellipse gets added as a child of this canvas. Now, this syntax looks a little bit confusing, but what it's doing is these are attached properties. So what you're saying is I know I've dynamically created an ellipse, but I need to know where to put that ellipse. So this is how you set that attached property. So you're basically saying, hey, this ellipse, it's going to go inside of a canvas eventually. So I want to set the left and right position here. Then you add it to the canvas so it knows where to actually do that. And again, that's those attached properties that we saw, like this one, for example. This is essentially what you're doing in code. Because remember, all of this, it does get converted to C#, and anything you want, you can also do it in code here. So here's some more. So for example, here's that mouse left button down. It just says I should paint. Here's the mouse button up. I should not paint. And then down here, you can see there's this, whether it should erase it. Here's whether the mouse is moving. Should I paint or should I not paint? Should I erase? If so, figure out the position of the mouse. Now this object E right here is actually part of this. So like if you were to double click a button, or in this case, if you set the mouse move, it actually has parameters that get passed in. We'll go into this later on, but essentially what passes in through this object sender variable is whatever element that actually raised this event. And so in this case, it's the mouse. So what we can do is we can use this mouse event args to say eat.getPosition, and that'll give us the position of our mouse, and it returns a point, and that's where we pass into our method that we already looked at, that paint circle. That's how it knows where to paint inside of our circle. And then there's just a few other ones we're checking our radio boxes and things like that. Now let's go over here to our routed events. So this is another example from our book, 32.11. So WPF has what are called routed events within our UI elements. So before I do anything, I'm just going to go ahead and run this application, and let's take a look at what it actually does. It's a really simple application, but it explains a concept that can be a little bit confusing. And what it is this idea of tunneling versus bubbling on our events. Now in Windows Forms, let's say you had a group box which had a grid, which had another canvas, which had a label, so it had all these sub elements. In Windows Forms, if you click this button, you just handle the event for that button. Now in WPF, most of the time that's what you want, but there's this added layer of being able to actually control how these events happen. And that's through what's called tunneling and bubbling. So what you'll notice is this is called tunneling up here, and this is called bubbling down here. So if I were to click this label here, you can see something happens. Okay, it says this is a tunneling event. The first thing that happens is, oh, what actually happened is the event got put through the group box, and then the second thing that happened was our label click actually occurred. So you can see there's like a visual tree here. So let's take a look at this group box right here in the XAML behind the scenes while this application is running. You can see I've got this group box. Within that group box, I've got a label. Now in this particular tunneling, you can see that I'm handling an event called preview mouse left button up. And that's for my group box right here. Within the group box, I've got a label, this sub element, that's called preview mouse left button up. And I call this tunneling. This is the event that gets called. And now you'll notice I'm calling the exact same method for both of these. That'll make sense in just a second of what's actually going on behind the scenes. But what does this mean? Preview mouse left button down versus this bubbling where it says mouse left button up and mouse left button up for my group box and my label. So a group box has both a preview mouse left button up and a regular mouse left button up. Well, the reason for these difference, where there's this preview keyword on this mouse left button up, is this tunneling or bubbling. And it essentially says if you handle this preview event, then it's actually going to get called second. So this gets called, then this gets called. Where in bubbling, this event gets called, then this event gets called. Well, why the heck do you care? Most of the time you don't. But there will be times where maybe you need to stop this event at a higher level before it ever reaches here. So maybe there's something that you need to know as it comes down these events before it even gets here. You need to have it do something so that you click this and you do something all the way down and then you eventually do this. You would do tunneling. If you need it to start here and then bubble out, you would do it here. Now again, the vast majority of the time, you don't need to worry about bubbling or tunneling, but I wanted you to understand the difference between the two. Now let's take a look at the actual code. So let's do the bubbling. So this is going to be more familiar to us that we've done before. So again, we've got this group box, and we're saying the bubbling event, the method is called bubbling. For mouse left button up and then mouse left button up, we've called bubbling twice. So if we come over here and we take a look at bubbling, so here's the method. So the same method is called, irrelevant if we click the label or the group box. It says call the same event. So what's going to happen is that it first says, again, here's this mouse left button. It says if e.source equals the sender. So essentially it's saying, is this the actual child element, which is a label in this case, or is it the parent, which is the group box? So let's set a breakpoint here and go ahead and run it, because I think this will be easier to understand what's actually going on in the code. So I'm going to go ahead and click this now. Now remember, I clicked that label in that group box one time. But you'll notice it called the bubbling. Now did e.source equal the sender? So the sender is that label. You can see that here's my label that actually got clicked. So it's saying this is what gets called. So it's calling this mouse left button up, and it's calling the method bubbling. It's saying, hey, am I the label? Yes or no? Yes, I am. So clear out my log, which is just this little space that gets created, this little text box over here. Just clear that out. Now we're on the first level, because you have as many levels as you want. This is only going to have 2, so we're just setting that to 1. It'll make sense in just a second. Now we're going to add some text that says this is a bubbling event. Then what we're going to do is add that to whatever is in this bubbling step. We're just going to essentially, what we want to do is we want to write out the name of the control that got clicked. Again, don't worry too much about this syntax. Essentially, it's just saying print out the name of the control. Now I'm going to press F5 and watch what happens. I say go ahead and continue running. Now look, it actually called this method a second time automatically. Why? Because first it called this method, then it called this one. We could have created 2 separate, completely different methods, but we decided just to do one so we could show you that essentially gets bubbled up and both events get called. Now this is now going to be false because my sender is actually now that group box. So we can see it's now the group box. So you can see how it skips over that because the original source was from that label. And so it doesn't do this because now we're not resetting things, we're not clearing things out because we know this is the second time it got called. And now we're going to print out the name of this control to our log. Go ahead and press F5. And so we can see what happened was when it called this method, it cleared this out. The first time through it said, okay, print out the group box and then call the label. So that's why these things got printed out the way they did. So first the label got called, then the group box got called. Now let's take a look at the tunneling event. So if we come up here now, let's set another breakpoint. So now what we're going to see is the opposite. So when I click right here, the first time through, it's going to handle the event of the group box, then it's going to handle the event of the label. So I click here, and you'll notice that this right here is the name of the group box. So I press F10, and it's going to skip over this because it's not the button. The next time through now, this is the name of the label. So you can see the first time through is the group box, this time is the label. Now I'll turn off these breakpoints so we can kind of see what actually is happening again. And so now when I click here, you can see the first thing that happens is the label. The second thing is the event of the group box. Up here, it's the opposite. See how it goes the group box and then the label? Again, I know it can be a little bit confusing. The vast majority of the time you don't even care, but you just want to know in the back of your mind that there is this level. And I have used this on a rare occasion. I do have to actually know the difference between the 2 different types of events. So those are what are called routed events. So next, let's take a look at this color chooser application, figure 3215 in the book. Let me go ahead and run this. Now this application, we've got these slider controls, which we haven't used yet, but they're pretty straightforward. They're a slider. And you can see what happens is as I slide these different controls, it comes up with a number over here, a hex value, for how it's defining these different colors here. So it's just a color picker, essentially, is all it's really doing. Now, what we're going to learn about now is what are called styles. Now, this is very similar to HTML styles. So whenever you're having a lot of repeated controls that have the same functionality, and you want them to look and feel the same, you can create what's called a style, just like in HTML. So essentially what we're saying is, hey, apply this style to this slider, and this slider, and this slider, so they all look exactly the same. But what we can do is we can set a whole bunch of properties for a slider and then just apply it one time to each of these controls, so that if later on we can change that property in one place and it'll be applied everywhere through here. I also want to say that for the next little bit, we're going to be going over some syntax that can be, again, a little bit confusing. There's a little bit of a learning curve to it. Don't worry too much. We're going to have additional lectures that dives into this syntax again and again to hopefully sink in. You won't even need to use these styles for any of your programs, but every single professional application uses what are called styles. You absolutely should use them rather than hard coding everything. And if you've taken an HTML class, you probably know what I'm talking about as far as cascading style sheets go. So let's go ahead and minimize some of this stuff. Let's take a look. First, let's take a look at our what a slider control is. So here's our slider control. Now, our slider control, here's the name of it. You'll notice that here's the grid row, right? So we take a look up here. We've got a window. We've got a grid. It has some rows and columns. We've already learned about all of that, so I'm just going to kind of skip over. Again, within each of our labels, it tells us which column, which row. Our slider control, same thing. Which grid, which row do we want? Or sorry, which row and column inside of our grid do we want it to be in? Now, again, we've got this slider control over and over again. Again, we could have 10 of these, 20 of these. What we don't want to have to do is continually set the exact same properties over here over and over again. Because what would happen is if on this one, this was the first one, we dragged it over there, we set it up exactly like we wanted, and so let's say, the max value, something like that, the max value that the slider controls. So right now it can go from 0 to 255 on this side. But let's say I set this one to 300, and then I copied and pasted each of these over and over again. But then I said to myself, okay, I actually want it to be 255. Well, now I have to change 255 and 255, 255 for each of these various slider controls. So it would be better to use a style for each of the controls. So let's take a look at that. So here's my slider control. Here's its name. Here's where it should go. And now we've got this style syntax. It's a little bit confusing. You get used to it. So inside this style, you'll notice that first it's just got these, just like most attributes, we've got these single quotes on each side. Inside of there, anytime you can see this sort of bracket syntax like this, just like we would in C# itself, essentially it's kind of like, hey, I'm going to write a little bit of code in between here. It is kind of what this means. So what it's saying here is hey, the style of this slider should be called slider style. So this slider style has to be named somewhere. And if I come up here into my Windows resources, there so happens to be a style called slider style, which we're going to come back to in just a second. Now this keyword static resource, they're static or dynamic. I'm going to kind of skip over that for right now. Again, I just don't want to confuse things with too many topics. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Most of the time you can use static. There's various reasons why you'd use one or the other. It doesn't matter for our purposes now. So for all, just ignore static resource. But it's just saying, hey, I want to create a resource, point it to this slider style. That's what I want you to instantiate and put into this style. Again, this is just an attribute. So if you were to dynamically create a slider, that was called red slider, you would say red slider dot style, and you could assign it a new style. So what is this style that we're pointing to? Well, it's a resource. Now, again, over here in our app.xaml, these are resources associated with our entire application. So if every slider in an application, we wanted it to look the exact same way on every single window, you could put that slider style here and all of our windows could use it. Now, if you have a slider that just is on this window and you want it just to look a particular way for each of the unique sliders, you would put it as part of its Windows resources here. So let's go ahead now. So in our window.resources, we're going to create a new style. This key is essentially just the name of it, called slider style. Again, it could have been banana. It doesn't matter. That's just the name of it. That's how we call it. We reference it down here. So within it, we have these what are called setters. So we're setting a property of a slider control. And so you have to know what they are. So for example, if I come down, you can see here it's called slider.width. So if I came down here and I clicked on my slider, you'll notice that if I come down, there's a slider.width value. Now you see that I've initially set this to 256. Well, what happens if I set this to 500? Now you'll notice that every single one of my sliders, because it has that style applied, all go out to 500 or 100. But again, if every single slider, I can have 100 of these sliders in my application, now I can change it in one place and it'll change it throughout my application. So let's go ahead and change that back to 256. Well, why did they change that to 256? Well, because they wanted a min of 0 and a maximum of 255. So we could have, instead of 255, we could have set this to 100. Now if I set this to 100 and run it, watch what happens. That automatically all of these just get set to 100. And I sort of got that for free because I set it in one place. Now if I change that back to 255, by changing it in one place, every one of these now can go up to 255. So this is, in past lectures, you've heard me say things about designing out your code, plan out your code, think through it, sketch it out. Well, this is exactly one of those things you want to think through. Why, when you're going through your UI, you say, am I going to be repeating the same control over and over again? That's the perfect use of these setters in our style. So you'll notice we have the min, we have the max, we have the vertical alignment, we have the initial value here, etc., etc. So you can style every property associated with that slider. Now you can do the exact same things for buttons and labels and text boxes, and every application I've created in the real world, that's exactly what I've done. Or there are actually companies that create very professional looking styles that you can purchase. There's even some you can just get for free. And then you just slap it on here and it makes it look professional and you got it for free. And you didn't have to do any of this type of coding itself. And it sets all the colors and the values for you. Now the next thing here is this little event setter. I'm going to put this on one line just so we can see it a little bit better. And what this says is okay, not only do I want to set visually just how these all look the same, I can even set the event handler for each of these. So you notice it's called event setter. What is the event? Slider.value changed. And the handler is going to be slider.value changed. So if I were to come over to my code, and let's just take a look at that, and sure enough, look at this. I've got one method now called slider value changed. Now if I come down to my slider, you'll notice that I'm not handling any of the events within the code here. Because I wanted, no matter which one of these sliders you use, I wanted them all to call the same method. Now I could have just come in here and hard-coded the same event handler into each of these, or I can use this event setter. So I can say that, hey, every time the value is changed, so if I come back to my slider here and I go to my events and I scroll down, you can see that here's the event, value changed. So I'm just saying, whenever the value is changed, call this method. Now, I want to point out, I don't have this syntax memorized. Maybe your other professors do. I don't. Because what happens a lot of times when I'm creating my applications, the very first thing I do is create all of this user interface. So I may spend months on just my UI and I become a WPF expert. But then for the next year after I've got my UI defined, I never touch this again. I'm just behind the scenes in my code, so I forget this exact syntax. But just go on the internet, it's really easy with the IntelliSense and the internet to figure out exactly how this needs to be set up. So again, I know it's confusing. It's perfectly normal to be confused and have it kind of be a little bit overwhelming. It just takes time. You just have to kind of do it over and over again. Again, if you were just to give me this on a test, I probably couldn't type a lot of this out. I just forget. It's reality. I got to make room in my brain for other topics. So now you can see how by applying one style to all of our various sliders, they can all look and feel the same. Now let's take a look, and this one is a really unique application. It's figure 3223. Now I'm going to start off by running it, and it's a little bit hard to kind of see what's going on here. But essentially, this is the entire window of our application. Now you'll notice it doesn't look anything like a normal window, right? It has these little things up here, but these are actually buttons. There's no border. There's no minimize and maximize and all those things, and we've got this weird thing here. And let's go ahead and close it down. Let's see what in the heck they actually did here. Now remember, with WPF, you can do virtually anything you want to do. So in this case, they've actually said, okay, for my window, I don't want it to look like a normal window. So they've set all the normal properties, but right here, look what they've done. For the window style, they've set it to none. And they've also said allow transparency to true. So what they're essentially saying, watch what happens when I run this. See how there's not actually like a perfectly square outline? See how it's actually just a circle? That's because of that. They got rid of the window style and they allowed for the transparency. Now, if I were to go ahead and cut both of these out, and now I run my application, it's going to look like a normal window. I mean to a certain degree, right? So you can see that if I make this a little bit larger, it's a little bit easier to grab here. And you can see now that it actually does just create this button, and it has this normal window background and the collapse and things like this. So just by adding in these two little things here, you make your window look completely different. Now, do you need to do this very often? No. Again, just kind of showing you the power. Also, with the window itself, it's also it's handling the mouse left button down event. So now let's take a look at what they've actually had to do in order to get the application to look this way. So I'm going to hide the window resources real fast. Windows background, they actually have this image brush for this circle. So this is actually a picture, this circle back here. And so they've just said, hey, the whole Windows background, just make it, hold this circle, which is this little circle here. And that's, if I double click it, there's the circle for that PNG file. Not too exciting. They've also had a grid where you can see they've got two rows in it. One row, they've said, hey, take up as little room as possible. The other row, basically take up all the rest. And so you can see right here, here's this first row. Now, because they've said I want this window to look nothing like a window, but I need the user to be able to, close the window, essentially, I'm going to create my own little X, my own little minimize here. So to do that, they've created this grid. Now what they're going to do is on this first row of the grid, they added a couple buttons here of their own. And these buttons, you'll notice they don't look like normal buttons. I mean, if I came up here and said, look at my toolbox, open this, and let's drag a button on here, right? This button here looks absolutely nothing like these buttons up here. So how do we make such a button that looks nothing like a button? Well, that's what's nice about WPF. You don't have to have a button look like a button. Now, when I take this button and I drag it onto here, why does it look like a button, essentially, right? What we would imagine a button to look like. Well, WPF, what they've actually done is they've styled this button for you, and they've created styles, and they've created what's called a template for you behind the scenes. And so this button has what's called a default template already applied to it. Now, what's interesting about that is every WPF control, whether it's a button or label, any control is actually what's called lookless. And what that means, it actually has no visual. It's lookless. There's nothing to the visual aspect of a button until it gets a template applied to it. And there is something called a default template. And that's why this button looks the way it does. When I drag it on here, there is a default template that's already applied to it. Later on, I'm going to show you how to look at that default template and how you can manipulate it. That's a later lecture. I'm going to go ahead and delete this button. But for now, let's say that we want this button to look very special. I've created applications that had to do with nutrition, for example. I created a custom nutrition application, and I wanted to have little buttons on there that the user could click a button and it would generate some random meals for them. So it had a little button and it had a little steak as an icon. So rather than looking like a button, it looked like a little steak that you could click on and it would generate some meals for you. Or imagine you're going to your dentist office and they have those little software programs that you see them run. Take a look at the buttons that they can click on. A lot of them don't look like buttons. They look like a tooth, or they look like a drill, something like that. And so out now in the real world, when you're running applications, hopefully you start picking up on that a button doesn't have to look like a button. And in WPF, this is how you do it, with something called a template. So here's my button, and everything else is exactly the same. I'm just saying, I could have changed the background to a color. They set it up to minimize here. That's what these X's and stuff. So if I click the close, you can see it's just an X. They could have used text. It didn't matter. They chose just an image for the back of it. The thing we care about is this template syntax. Now, if we go back to the color chooser, you'll notice that it looks a lot just like the style here, okay, where it's a static resource, hey, point to the style. If we come over here, we access the template property, and it's a static resource, but we were saying apply the button template to it. Now, a template can also include styling. But let's come up here and let's say what they wanted our buttons to look like. And also, by the way, you'll notice both buttons have the same template applied to it. That's why they kind of look the same. So now we come up here to our Windows resources. And so rather than a style, so we come up here, you'll notice in our Windows resources we have a style, which is just sort of the look and feel. We're just changing the attributes, the properties of our normal slider. Well, we want to change what a slider even looks like, or what a button even looks like in this case. So it's a control template. Again, this is just the name of it, called button template. If I scroll down here, you can see there's button template. That's how it references it. The target type is a button. So you have to actually define, hey, what control is this template going to apply to? Well, it's applying to a button control. Well, what is a button? What is my special button template? Well, that's anything you want between here and here. Anything you want. In WPF, you could have canvases and labels and controls and images, anything you want. And that's where the creativity comes in. You can now make this button look like anything you want. In this case, they said, I want to have a border. And you can kind of see, here's the border. And that border, I want a border thickness of 2, corner radius of 2, and I want it to be royal blue. Let's change just one of these. Instead of 2, let's change it to 20. So you can now see how it changes that outline, and the border thickness is now 20, now it's 2. Or again, royal blue, you could change this to red or anything else that you wanted. And they also put what's called a content presenter in here. Now this content, it's actually binding the content. I'm going to skip over this just a little bit right here because it can be a little more confusing, and in later on lectures, we'll talk about it, and we're actually going to talk about it down below. So I'll just kind of skip over this for right now. But what I want you to understand is just that you can create a template for a button or label or anything else, and you can put anything you want in here, and it'll change every button that template is applied to. Again, don't worry too much about the syntax right now, because later on we're going to actually create templates ourselves and styles. And just like the style, we can create these triggers. So for example, it says trigger whenever there is a mouse over. So it's saying whenever I mouse over this button, I want to then set some values of property. So look what happens. So automatically, and I'm writing this all in XAML rather than C# behind the scenes, I'm saying when the mouse is over, I want to set the border, okay, the property of background to this light blue. So let's run this, and it might help it just a little bit of what we're actually doing here. Let me move it over to here so it's in the same spot. Now if I highlight this, do you see how the background changes to blue? So again, that's what properties it care about. the background. What value should it change it to? Light blue. So see how that works? Now I wrote no code. All I wrote was XAML, and it took care of it for me. Now behind the scenes, this does get changed to C#. And it's just like saying, inside this border, so it's saying, border dot background, set it to light blue whenever this event occurs. But you can also do it here in your XAML. Now, as we're getting more confusing, right, that's why you start wanting to have your XML comments or your XAML comments. So let's kind of go over that again. So we've got our button. We've said we want to make all of our buttons look the same. So we're going to create a template. We're going to call the button template, which we defined up here in our Windows resource. We set up a control template. We define what that means, and then that gets assigned to each button. And that's how things get set within our code. So hopefully you can kind of see just the power that is implemented within WPF. The only thing I can say again, you have to go into every single control, you have to put them on here, you have to use them, you have to start setting all the properties, kind of get used to the different events that you can handle. And just like you've probably started getting a lot more familiar with Windows Forms, you'll do the same thing with WPF. So good luck.